I am the macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The Mirror of Darkness. Sophia wandered through the narrow, cobblestone streets of the old city, her camera slung over her shoulder. She loved this part of town, with its crumbling buildings and hidden shops that seemed to exist outside of time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air smelled faintly of rain and moss. She was searching for inspiration, something unusual, something that could spark her next art project. Little did she know, her life was about to change forever. The antique shop appeared suddenly, as if it hadn't been there moments before. Its windows were dusty, and the sign above the door, barely legible, read "Relics of the Past." Sophia hesitated, drawn to the shop's eerie charm but also unsettled by its ominous aura. She pushed the creaking door open, a bell jingling softly as she stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and incense. The shop was cluttered with oddities, ancient clocks, tarnished jewelry, and furniture that looked as though it had been carved in another century. Sophia's eyes were instantly drawn to a large mirror leaning against the far wall. Its frame was blackened with age, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when she looked at them too closely. She moved closer, her heart inexplicably racing. The mirror's surface was cloudy, as if coated in a fine layer of ash. Yet, when Sophia leaned in, her reflection appeared unnaturally sharp, almost too vivid. She reached out to touch the frame, her fingers brushing against the cold, pitted metal. A shiver ran down her spine, and she felt a strange pull, as though the mirror was calling to her. "That one's special," a voice croaked from the shadows. Sophia jumped, turning to see an elderly man emerging from behind a stack of old books. His eyes were sunken, his skin paper-thin, and his voice carried a weight that made her uneasy. "It's been here a long time," he said, his gaze lingering on the mirror. "How old is it?" Sophia asked, trying to sound casual despite the growing sense of dread. The old man chuckled softly, a sound that was more like a wheeze. "Old enough," he replied cryptically. "It's not for everyone, you know. It chooses its owners." Sophia frowned, intrigued despite herself. "What do you mean, it chooses?" The man's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It has a history, this mirror. A dark one. Some say it's cursed." He paused, studying her face. "But you don't believe in curses, do you?" She laughed nervously, brushing off his words. "Of course not. It's just a mirror." The old man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "If you say so," he murmured. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "It's yours for $200. Take it if you dare." Sophia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to walk away. But something about the mirror held her captive, as though it had already claimed her. She pulled out her wallet, handing over the money without another word. The old man hesitated, then took the cash, his hands trembling slightly. As he wrapped the mirror in an old cloth, he muttered under his breath, words Sophia couldn't quite catch. When he handed it to her, his eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "Be careful," he said softly. "It's not just a mirror." Sophia left the shop, the mirror tucked under her arm. The streets seemed quieter now, the sunlight dimmer. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though no one was around. By the time she reached her apartment, the sense of unease had grown into a knot of dread. She placed the mirror in her living room, unaware of the darkness she had just invited into her home. When she looked into the mirror one last time before bed, she swore her reflection smiled back at her, a smile that wasn't her own. The first night with the mirror in her apartment felt off. Sophia couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the strange day she'd had. But when she walked past the mirror on her way to bed, she paused. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was different. The angle seemed wrong, as though the mirror was tilted just slightly, even though she knew it wasn't. The next morning, Sophia woke up feeling unrest, as though she hadn't slept at all. She made her way to the kitchen, yawning and rubbing her eyes, but as she passed the mirror, she froze. Her reflection was already standing there, waiting for her. It wasn't mimicking her movements. It was just staring. Sophia blinked, her breath catching in her throat. When she looked again, her reflection was normal, her face as tired and confused as she felt. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light or her sleep-deprived mind. But as the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she glanced at the mirror, her reflection seemed to move a fraction of a second slower than she did. Once, she swore she saw it tilt its head, as if studying her. She quickly covered the mirror with a sheet, but even then, she could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on her. That night, the nightmares began. Sophia dreamt she was trapped in the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass as her reflection laughed from the other side. The sound was low and guttural, not her voice at all. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The sheet had fallen off the mirror, and the room was bathed in an eerie, silvery light. Her reflection was gone. The mirror showed only an empty room behind her. The next day, Sophia avoided the mirror entirely, focusing on her work to distract herself. But as she painted, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing behind her, watching her every stroke. She turned around several times, but no one was there. When she finally looked up from her canvas, she gasped. The mirror had somehow shifted, turning slightly to face her directly. She hadn't touched it, she was sure of it. That evening, Sophia decided to confront her fear. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, daring it to move. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her reflection raised its hand, not when she did, but on its own. Sophia stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection smirked, its eyes glinting with something dark and malicious. She threw the sheet back over the mirror and called her best friend, Anna. Her voice trembling as she described what had happened. Anna laughed at first, telling her she'd been working too hard and needed to relax. But when Sophia insisted, Anna reluctantly agreed to come over and see the mirror for herself. When Anna arrived, she was skeptical but willing to play along. Sophia uncovered the mirror, and the two of them stood in front of it, staring at their reflections. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then Anna's reflection turned its head to look at Sophia's reflection, which grinned back. Anna screamed, grabbing Sophia's arm and pulling her away. "What the hell is that thing?" she demanded, her face pale. Sophia didn't have an answer. She only knew that the mirror was no ordinary object, and whatever was inside it was growing stronger. Anna stayed the night, but neither of them slept much. They kept the mirror covered, but every time they thought it was safe, they would hear a faint tapping, like someone knocking on glass. The next morning, Anna left, promising to look into the mirror's history. Sophia spent the day researching, her hands shaking as she typed. She found stories of cursed objects and haunted mirrors, but nothing specific. Still, the pieces were starting to come together. The symbols on the frame, the strange warnings from the shopkeeper, it all pointed to something dark and ancient. By the time night fell, Sophia felt like she was losing her mind. The mirror seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible energy. She tried to ignore it, but every time she walked past it, she felt an icy chill, as though someone had brushed past her. Her reflection was no longer hers, it moved independently, its eyes hollow and its smile cruel. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know where to start. The mirror wasn't just haunting her, it was controlling her, twisting her reality. As she lay in bed that night, she heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. It was her voice, but the words weren't hers. "I'm still here," it whispered, "and I'm not letting go." The whispering started the next night, soft and insidious, like the rustling of dead leaves. At first, Sophia thought it was her imagination, a trick of the wind or the old pipes in her apartment. But as the hours passed, the voices grew louder, more distinct. They were speaking in a language she didn't understand, a guttural, hissing tongue that made her skin crawl. She tried to ignore it, burying herself under the blankets and pressing a pillow over her ears. But the voices seeped through, relentless and mocking. They seemed to come from the mirror, though she couldn't be sure. Every time she thought they were fading, they would swell again, louder and more urgent. She finally gave up on sleep, sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, her heart pounding. The next morning, she was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her hands trembling as she made coffee. The voices had stopped with the dawn, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. She avoided the mirror entirely, keeping it covered and refusing to even glance in its direction. But she could feel it watching her, its presence like a shadow in the corner of her mind. That afternoon, Anna called, her voice tight with concern. "I found something," she said. "It's about the symbols on the mirror. I'll come over tonight and explain." Sophia agreed, grateful for the company but dreading the conversation. She didn't want to know the truth, but deep down, she knew she had no choice. When Anna arrived that evening, she brought a stack of old books and printouts. She looked serious, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something grim. "Sit down," she said, spreading the papers out on the coffee table. "This is going to sound crazy, but I think the mirror is tied to something ancient, like centuries old." Sophia listened as Anna explained the symbols on the frame, each one representing a different element of an ancient ritual. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was a vessel, designed to trap spirits and channel their energy. "Whoever owned it before you," Anna said, her voice low, "they were using it for something dark, really dark." Before Sophia could respond, the whispering started again, louder this time, almost deafening. Anna's eyes widened as she heard it too, her face pale. "You hear that, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia nodded, her heart racing. The voices were speaking in unison now, a chant that made the air vibrate with an unnatural energy. They uncovered the mirror, their hands trembling as they stared at their reflections. The glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Sophia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She clutched Anna's arm to steady herself, but Anna was just as shaken, her eyes wide with fear. Then, suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, and the air felt charged, as though a storm was about to break. Sophia's reflection stared back at her, but its eyes were black, hollow pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. It opened its mouth, and when it spoke, its voice was not hers. "You cannot escape," it said, each word dripping with malice. Anna screamed, pulling Sophia away from the mirror and throwing the sheet back over it. The two of them huddled together on the couch, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "We have to get rid of it," Anna said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep it here." Sophia agreed, but she didn't know how. She couldn't just throw it away. What if someone else found it? What if it came back? She felt trapped, the mirror's presence like a noose tightening around her neck. That night, the voices returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They called her name over and over, until she thought she would go mad. She covered her ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside, they were inside her head, whispering secrets she didn't want to hear. By the time dawn broke, Sophia was a wreck, her nerves frayed and her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, but she didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, Sophia awoke with a sense of grim determination. The mirror had to go, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get rid of it. Anna had stayed the night, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and trying to plan their next move. "We can't just throw it away," Anna said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to destroy it properly, like ritually." Sophia nodded, though the idea of performing a ritual made her uneasy. She didn't know the first thing about rituals, but she knew they had to try something. Anna pulled out her phone, scrolling through websites and forums about cursed objects. "There's a lot of conflicting advice," she said, "but most people agree that fire is the best way to destroy something like this." "Fire," Sophia repeated, her stomach twisting. The thought of setting the mirror ablaze filled her with dread, but she couldn't think of a better option. "Where would we even do that?" she asked. Anna hesitated, then said, "The old church on the edge of town. It's abandoned, and no one would notice us there." The idea was risky, but Sophia was desperate. They spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies, matches, a bottle of lighter fluid, and a heavy bag to carry the mirror in. Anna also printed out instructions for a simple protection ritual, which involved drawing a circle of salt and burning sage. "It's probably not foolproof," she admitted, "but it's better than nothing." That evening, they drove to the abandoned church, the mirror wrapped in a thick blanket and tucked into the back seat. The church was a crumbling relic of the past, its steeple leaning precariously and its windows shattered. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the fading light. They carried the mirror inside, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. The altar was still intact, though covered in dust and cobwebs. They set the mirror down in front of it, and Sophia carefully drew a circle of salt around it, her hands trembling slightly. Anna lit the sage, waving it around the room as she muttered the words of the ritual. "Now or never," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened the bottle of lighter fluid and poured it over the mirror, the acrid smell making her eyes water. Anna handed her the matches, and Sophia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She struck a match, the flame flickering in the dim light, and dropped it onto the mirror. The fire roared to life, the flames licking hungrily at the mirror's frame. For a moment, Sophia felt a flicker of hope. Then, the mirror began to crack, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. The flames turned an unnatural shade of green, and a thick black smoke began to rise from the glass. The voices returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, screaming in a language that made Sophia's ears ache. The smoke swirled around them, forming shapes that seemed to reach out with clawed hands. Sophia and Anna stumbled back, choking on the thick, acrid air. The fire burned hotter and brighter, the mirror's frame twisting and warping as though alive. Then, with a deafening crack, the mirror shattered, shards of glass flying in every direction. The silence that followed was deafening. The fire flickered and died, leaving only a pile of ash and twisted metal. Sophia and Anna stood frozen, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Is it over?" Sophia finally asked, her voice trembling. Anna nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear. "I think so," she said, "but we should go now." They left the church quickly, not looking back as they drove away. Sophia felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The mirror was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint whisper, so soft she thought she imagined it. "I'm still here," it said. The days after the ritual were strange and unsettling. Sophia tried to convince herself that the mirror was truly gone, but the whispers lingered, faint but unmistakable. They came at random times, usually when she was alone, and they always carried the same chilling message, "I'm still here." She tried to ignore them, but they gnawed at the edges of her mind, relentless and unnerving. Anna came over often, her presence a comforting distraction from the growing unease. The two of them talked about everything except the mirror, but Sophia could tell Anna was worried. She had seen the fear in Anna's eyes at the church, and she knew her friend was just as haunted by the experience. Still, they both pretended everything was fine, as though that would make it true. Then, one night, Sophia woke up to the feeling of someone standing over her bed. She froze, her heart pounding, too afraid to open her eyes. The air was thick and cold, and she could hear breathing slow, deliberate, and not her own. She finally forced herself to look, but the room was empty. The whispers started again, louder this time, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The next morning, Sophia called Anna, her voice shaking as she described what had happened. Anna came over immediately, and the two of them searched the apartment for any sign of an intruder. They found nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left. "Maybe it's just stress," Anna suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You've been through a lot." Sophia wanted to believe her, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The mirror was gone, but whatever had been inside it was still with her, lurking in the shadows. That afternoon, she tried to distract herself by working on a painting, but the colors turned dark and muddy, the shapes twisted and unnatural. She stepped back, horrified, realizing the painting looked exactly like the mirror's frame. That night, the shadows seemed to come alive. They stretched and shifted, forming shapes that moved when she wasn't looking. Sophia tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in the darkness. She turned on every light in the apartment, but the shadows only grew deeper, more menacing. She called Anna in a panic, her voice trembling as she described the shadows. Anna tried to calm her down, but Sophia could hear the fear in her friend's voice. "I'll come over," Anna said, "but you have to promise me you'll stay calm. We'll figure this out together." When Anna arrived, the apartment felt colder, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. They sat on the couch, the lights blazing, but the shadows still seemed to press in around them. "What if it's not just the mirror?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's something bigger, something that was trapped inside it?" Sophia didn't want to think about it, but she knew Anna was right. The mirror had been a vessel, and whatever it contained had been set free. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Anna hesitated, then said, "There are people who deal with stuff like this. Mediums, exorcists, people who know how to fight the supernatural. We could reach out to someone. It's worth a try." Sophia nodded, though the idea of involving a stranger filled her with unease. Still, she knew they were out of options. They spent the rest of the night researching, their laptops open to forums and websites dedicated to the paranormal. They found a few names, people who claimed to have experience with cursed objects and malevolent spirits. "We'll call them in the morning," Anna said, trying to sound reassuring. But as the night wore on, the shadows grew bolder. They seemed to swirl around Sophia and Anna, their edges sharp and their shapes vaguely human. Sophia clutched Anna's hand, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, and Sophia felt a wave of icy dread wash over her. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anna didn't respond, but her grip tightened, her eyes wide with fear. The shadows seemed to close in around them, the room growing colder and darker until Sophia could barely see. She felt a presence, close and overwhelming, and the whispers became a single, deafening voice. "You're mine." The next morning, Sophia and Anna called a medium named Clara, whose name had come up repeatedly in their research. She agreed to meet them that afternoon, and the two friends spent the morning nervously preparing for her arrival. Sophia cleaned the apartment in a desperate attempt to feel some control over the situation, but the shadows still lingered, darker and more menacing than ever. Clara arrived just after noon, her presence calming despite the tense atmosphere. She was a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through people. She carried a leather satchel filled with tools of her trade, candles, crystals, and bundles of dried herbs. Sophia and Anna watched nervously as she surveyed the apartment, her expression unreadable. "It's strong," Clara said finally, her voice low and measured. "Whatever's here, it's not just a spirit. It's something older, darker. Let me see the place where you kept the mirror." Sophia led her to the living room, her hands trembling as she pointed to the empty wall where the mirror had once hung. Clara knelt down, running her fingers over the floorboards, her eyes closed. After a long silence, Clara stood up, her expression grave. "The mirror was a trap," she said, "but it wasn't just containing the spirit, it was feeding it. And now that the mirror's gone, the thing inside it has latched onto you." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine, her stomach twisting with fear. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated, then said, "It means it's not going to let you go. Not without a fight." She opened her satchel and pulled out a bundle of sage, lighting it with a match. The smoke curled lazily into the air, filling the room with its earthy scent. "We'll start with a cleansing," she said, moving through the apartment with slow, deliberate steps. As Clara worked, Sophia and Anna watched in silence, their anxiety growing with every passing moment. The shadows seemed to recoil from the sage, their edges blurring as though the smoke was disrupting their form. But as Clara neared the living room, the air grew colder, the whispers returning in a cacophony of voices. Clara paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked around. "It's here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Stand back." She set the sage down and pulled a vial of clear liquid from her satchel, sprinkling it in a circle around herself. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Sophia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She clutched Anna's arm, her knees buckling as the room seemed to spin around her. Clara began to chant, her voice low and steady, the words in a language Sophia didn't recognize. The shadows began to swirl around her, their shapes twisting and contorting as though in pain. The air grew heavier, the pressure in the room almost unbearable. Sophia felt as though something was trying to pull her apart, her vision blurring as the whispers became a deafening roar. Then, with a sudden violent crack, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the candles Clara had lit earlier. The shadows seemed to close in around them, their edges sharp and menacing. Clara's chanting grew louder, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Sophia felt as though she was being pulled into the darkness, her body heavy and unresponsive. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the chanting stopped. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating as though they had been burned away. Clara lit a match, her face pale but composed. "It's gone for now," she said, her voice tired but firm. "But it's not over. This thing, it's tied to you, and it's not going to let you go." Sophia felt a wave of despair wash over her, tears streaming down her face. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Clara hesitated, then said, There's a ritual we can try, but it's dangerous. It would involve summoning the spirit and binding it, but if it goes wrong..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Sophia knew what she meant. Anna stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We'll do it," she said. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Sophia nodded, though her heart was pounding. She didn't know if she could survive another confrontation with the thing that haunted her, but she knew she couldn't go on like this. Clara prepared the ritual that evening, laying out candles, crystals, and a silver bowl filled with water. Sophia and Anna watched in silence, their anxiety growing with every passing moment. As the sun set and the room grew darker, Clara lit the candles and began to chant, her voice low and steady. The air grew heavy, the shadows once again beginning to swirl around them. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The room was eerily silent as Clara finished her preparations, the only sound the soft crackling of the candles. The air felt heavy, charged with an unsettling energy that made Sophia's skin crawl. Clara motioned for her to sit in the center of the circle, her expression serious but calm. "This won't be easy," Clara warned, her voice low. "You'll feel its presence more strongly than ever, but you have to stay focused. Don't let it take control." Sophia nodded, though her hands were trembling. She sat down on the floor, the cold seeping through her clothes as Clara lit the final candle. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, their shapes shifting in ways that made Sophia's stomach twist. Anna stood near the doorway, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on Sophia. "You can do this," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Clara began to chant, her voice deep and rhythmic, the words in a language that felt ancient and alien. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room swirling and twisting as though alive. Sophia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her vision blurring as the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. She clenched her fists, trying to stay focused, but the voices seemed to pull at her mind, tearing at her thoughts. Then, the candles flickered violently, their flames shrinking to mere pinpricks of light. The room was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the crystals Clara had placed around the circle. Sophia felt a presence, close and overwhelming, its breath cold against her skin. The whispers became a single, deafening voice, its words sharp and guttural, speaking a language that made her ears ache. Clara's chanting grew louder, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her words, the shadows recoiling as though burned. Sophia felt as though something was clawing at her mind, trying to force its way in. She focused on Clara's voice, letting it anchor her as the presence grew stronger, its cold filling her chest and making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the candles flared back to life, their flames burning unnaturally bright. The shadows parted, revealing a figure standing in the center of the circle. It was tall and gaunt, its features twisted and inhuman, its eyes glowing with a sickly, yellowish light. Sophia felt a wave of terror wash over her, her body frozen as the thing stared at her, its lips curling into a cruel smile. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. Clara's chanting didn't falter, her eyes locked on the entity. "Now!" she shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Sophia forced herself to speak, her voice trembling as she recited the words Clara had taught her. The entity's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing as it stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew colder, the pressure in the room almost unbearable. Sophia felt as though her body was being crushed, her vision darkening as the entity loomed over her. "You are mine," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Clara's chanting reached a crescendo, her voice ringing out like a bell. The candles flared, their flames turning an eerie shade of blue. The entity screamed, its form twisting and contorting as though it was being pulled apart. Sophia felt a wave of heat wash over her, the cold receding as the entity's grip on her loosened. She focused all her energy on the words, her voice growing stronger as the entity's form began to dissolve, its screams echoing in the darkness. Then, with a final deafening crack, the entity vanished, the room falling silent. The candles flickered and went out, leaving the three women in darkness. Sophia slumped to the floor, her body trembling as the weight of the experience crashed over her. Clara lit a match, her face pale but composed. "It's done," she said, her voice tired but firm. Anna rushed to Sophia's side, her hands shaking as she helped her friend sit up. Sophia felt weak, her body heavy and unresponsive, but the pressure in her chest was gone. The whispers were silent, the shadows still. She looked at Clara, tears streaming down her face. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "For now," she said. "But these things, they're never truly gone. You'll need to stay vigilant." Sophia nodded, though her mind was still reeling. She didn't know if she had the strength to face this again, but she knew she didn't have a choice. As the three of them sat in the quiet apartment, the weight of what had happened settled over them. The entity was gone, but its presence still lingered, a shadow in the back of Sophia's mind. She knew this wasn't the end, not really. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of relief, the silence a welcome respite from the chaos of the last few weeks. The days following the ritual were tense and surreal. Sophia felt as though she was walking through a dream, the world around her muted and distant. The whispers were gone, and the shadows no longer moved, but the memory of the entity lingered, a dark stain on her mind. She tried to return to her normal routine, but everything felt different, as though the experience had changed her in ways she couldn't yet understand. Anna stayed with her, her presence a constant comfort. They spent hours talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it all. "Do you think it's really gone?" Sophia asked one evening, her voice trembling. Anna hesitated, then said, "Clara said it was. But even if it is, you've been through something traumatic. It's going to take time to process." Clara visited a few days later, her expression calm but serious. She brought with her a small vial of salt water and a bundle of dried herbs, instructing Sophia to sprinkle the water around the apartment and burn the herbs to keep any lingering negativity at bay. "This isn't just about keeping the entity away," Clara explained. "It's about reclaiming your space, reminding yourself that you're in control." Sophia followed Clara's instructions, though the act felt almost too simple, too mundane for what she had experienced. Still, there was something comforting about it, a sense of ritual that helped ground her. She burned the herbs, the earthy scent filling the apartment, and sprinkled the salt water in every corner, her movements deliberate and focused. But even with Clara's reassurances, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She woke up every night drenched in sweat, her heart racing as fragments of nightmares slipped through her fingers like smoke. The dreams were always the same, the entity's cold, glowing eyes, its cruel smile, its whispered words, "You are mine." Anna suggested therapy, but Sophia hesitated. How could she explain any of this to a stranger? How could she talk about shadows and whispers and rituals without sounding completely insane? Still, she knew she couldn't keep it all bottled up forever. She confided in Anna, her voice breaking as she described the weight of her fear and the guilt she felt for bringing this into her life. "It's not your fault," Anna said firmly, her voice steady. "You didn't ask for this, and you're so much stronger than you think. You faced that thing, and you survived." Sophia wanted to believe her, but the words felt hollow, a bandage over a wound that was still raw and bleeding. She tried to distract herself with work, throwing herself into her paintings with a fervor she hadn't felt in months. But the colors still turned dark, the shapes twisted and unnatural. She painted the entity's face over and over, its glowing eyes staring back at her from the canvas. She hated the paintings, but she couldn't stop, as though purging the image from her mind required putting it on paper. Clara called a week later, her tone more serious than usual. "I've been doing some research," she said, "and I found something you need to see." They met at Clara's apartment, a cozy space filled with books and candles and the faint scent of incense. Clara handed Sophia a worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. "This belonged to someone who dealt with a similar entity," Clara explained. "From what I've read, these things don't just go away. They bide their time, wait for a moment of weakness. You'll need to stay vigilant, keep up the rituals, and protect yourself." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. The journal was filled with accounts of people who had encountered the entity, their stories eerily similar to hers. Many of them had thought they were rid of it, only to have it return years later, stronger and more malevolent than before. Sophia's heart sank as she read the final entry, the handwriting shaky and rushed. "It's back, and this time, I don't know if I can stop it." She closed the journal, her mind racing. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression calm but firm. "You fight," she said. "You stay strong and you fight. And if it comes back, you'll be ready." Despite Clara's reassurances, Sophia felt a growing sense of unease. The rituals and precautions she had taken felt fragile, like a thin veil barely holding back the darkness. She kept Clara's journal close, reading and rereading the entries, searching for any clue that might help her prepare for what was to come. But the more she read, the more she realized how little she truly understood about the entity. Anna continued to be her steadfast support, but even she seemed to feel the weight of the tension. "You're doing everything you can," she said one evening as they sat on Sophia's couch, the apartment bathed in the warm glow of candles. "If it comes back, we'll deal with it. You're not alone in this." Sophia nodded, but the words provided little comfort. Alone or not, she knew the entity's focus was solely on her. The nightmares persisted, though they had changed. No longer did the entity appear as a clear, menacing figure. Instead, it lingered at the edges of her dreams, its presence felt more than seen, its whispers faint but insidious. Sophia would wake up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, the echoes of its voice ringing in her ears. She began to dread sleep, often staying awake late into the night, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her. One night, as she was drifting off, she felt a sudden chill, the air in her bedroom growing icy. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then she saw a faint shadow in the corner of the room, its shape twisting and shifting as though alive. Her heart pounded, her body frozen as she watched the shadow grow, its edges sharpening until it took on a vaguely human form. The whisper came then, soft but unmistakable, "You cannot escape." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing as she tried to remember the protective rituals Clara had taught her. She reached for the vial of salt water on her nightstand, her hands trembling as she sprinkled it around her bed, repeating the words Clara had said, "You are not welcome here." The shadow seemed to hesitate, its form wavering, but it didn't retreat. Sophia grabbed her phone and called Anna, her voice shaking as she described what was happening. Anna was there in minutes, her face pale but determined. Together, they lit the candles and burned the herbs, the earthy scent filling the room. The shadow seemed to recoil, its form dissolving into the darkness, but Sophia knew it wasn't gone for good. The next morning, They called Clara, who arrived with a grim expression. "It's testing you," she said after hearing Sophia's account. "It's probing your defenses, looking for weaknesses. We need to strengthen the wards and prepare for its return." Clara spent the day reinforcing the protective measures, her movements precise and deliberate. But even as she worked, Sophia could see the worry in her eyes. That evening, Clara handed Sophia a small, intricately carved talisman. "Wear this," she said. "It's infused with protective energy. It won't stop the entity, but it will give you an edge." Sophia accepted the talisman, its weight cold against her palm. She clasped the chain around her neck, the talisman resting against her chest, its presence a small but steady comfort. The days that followed were tense, Sophia constantly on edge as she waited for the entity's next move. She began to feel as though she was living in a shadow world, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. She saw hints of the entity everywhere, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a whisper in the wind, a chill on her skin. She knew it was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Anna and Clara did their best to keep her spirits up, but Sophia could tell they were worried too. The entity's persistence was unlike anything Clara had encountered before, and its growing strength was a cause for alarm. "We'll figure this out," Clara assured her one evening, her voice steady but with an uncharacteristic note of uncertainty. "But you need to stay strong." Sophia tried to hold on to that strength, but it felt like trying to grasp water. The harder she tried, the more it slipped through her fingers. She felt as though she was being pulled apart, her mind and body fraying under the strain. The entity's presence was a constant weight, its whispers a relentless reminder that she was not safe, that it was only a matter of time before it returned. And then, one night, it did. The night the entity returned was unlike any other. The air in the apartment felt heavy, charged with an almost tangible energy that made Sophia's skin crawl. She had been sitting on the couch with Anna, trying to focus on a book, when the candles suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the talisman around Sophia's neck. "It's here," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. Anna grabbed her hand, her grip tight but reassuring. They sat in silence, listening to the oppressive stillness, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on them. Then the whispers began, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent, until they filled the room like a deafening roar. The shadows in the room began to move, twisting and merging into a single massive shape. Sophia felt a wave of terror wash over her as the entity materialized, its form clearer and more menacing than ever. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellowish light, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You thought you could be rid of me," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. Sophia's body trembled, but she forced herself to stand, her hand clutching the talisman. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The entity laughed, a sound that made her stomach twist. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its form shifting as it stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Anna stood beside Sophia, her face pale but resolute. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. The entity's smile faltered, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stared at them. Sophia felt a surge of determination, her fear giving way to anger. This thing had tormented her for too long, and she was done being its victim. She reached for the vial of salt water Clara had left them, sprinkling it in a wide arc around herself and Anna. The entity recoiled, its form wavering as the salt water hissed and steamed where it touched the shadows. Sophia repeated the protective words Clara had taught her, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. The entity's laughter turned to a snarl, its form twisting violently. Anna lit the bundle of dried herbs, the earthy smoke filling the room and driving the shadows back. The entity's form began to dissolve, its edges blurring as it fought against the protective measures. But Sophia knew it wouldn't be enough. The entity was too strong, its presence too deeply rooted. She needed to do more. She closed her eyes, focusing on the talisman around her neck. Clara had told her it was a conduit, a way to channel energy. She felt a surge of warmth from the talisman, her body tingling as she concentrated on pushing the entity out of her space. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but she refused to let them distract her. She visualized the entity being pulled apart, its form dissolving into nothingness. The room grew colder, the pressure in the air almost unbearable. Sophia felt as though she was being torn in two, her mind and body straining under the weight of the entity's resistance. But she held on, her focus unwavering. The talisman's warmth spread through her, giving her the strength she needed to keep fighting. Then, with a deafening crack, the entity screamed, its form shattering into fragments of darkness that scattered and faded into nothingness. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating as the shadows retreated. The candles flared back to life, their warm light filling the apartment. Sophia collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. Anna knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she helped Sophia sit up. "It's over," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Anna nodded, tears streaming down her face as she pulled Sophia into a tight hug. "It's over," she repeated, her voice filled with relief. They sat there for what felt like hours, the silence a welcome respite from the chaos of the last few weeks. Sophia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible, the weight of the entity's presence finally gone. She knew the scars would remain, the memories of what she had endured forever etched into her mind. But for now, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel safe, to believe that it was truly over. The cursed reflection. Anna had always been drawn to places that held secrets. It was a habit she couldn't shake, a curiosity that often led her down forgotten streets and into dusty, abandoned shops. That's how she found herself standing in front of an antique store tucked away in the oldest part of the city. The sign above the door was faded, the words "relics and rarities" barely legible. The window was cluttered with an assortment of mismatched objects, tarnished silverware, chipped porcelain dolls, and cracked picture frames. Something about the place felt alive, as if it were watching her. The bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and old fabric. The shop was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering through grimy windows, casting long shadows across the cluttered shelves. Anna wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the rough edges of forgotten treasures. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but she felt a pull, as though the shop itself was guiding her. At the back of the store, tucked into a corner, she saw it a full-length mirror. Its frame was ornate, crafted from tarnished silver, with intricate carvings of twisting vines and flowers. The glass was slightly clouded, but it seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Anna felt a strange mixture of awe and unease as she stared at it. It was beautiful, but there was something off about it. The shopkeeper appeared suddenly, startling Anna. She was an elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through her. "That mirror has a history," the woman said, her voice low and gravelly. "It's not for everyone." Anna frowned, intrigued. "What kind of history?" she asked. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "It's better if you don't know. But if you're drawn to it, perhaps it's meant to be yours." Anna ran a hand over the frame, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingers. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a connection to the mirror, as though it was calling to her. "I'll take it," she said firmly. The shopkeeper's expression darkened, but she didn't argue. She wrapped the mirror in an old cloth and helped Anna carry it to her car. As they loaded it into the back seat, The woman leaned in close. "Be careful," she whispered. "Some things are better left in the past." Anna drove home with the mirror in the back seat, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, but every time she looked in the rear-view mirror, all she saw was the cloth-covered glass. When she finally arrived at her apartment, she carefully carried the mirror inside, setting it up in her bedroom. It looked stunning against the wall, its intricate frame catching the light in a way that made the carvings seem almost alive. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the mirror as the moonlight spilled through her window. The glass seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the reflection. She sat up, her heart pounding, but when she looked again, there was nothing there. Just her own wide-eyed face staring back at her. Over the next few days, Anna began to notice subtle changes in her apartment. The air felt heavier, colder, and she often caught the faint scent of roses, though she hadn't brought any into the house. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of glass cracking, but when she turned on the light, the mirror was perfectly intact. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the strange sensations, it was the way the mirror seemed to watch her. Whenever she walked past it, she felt a prickling on the back of her neck, as though unseen eyes were following her every move. At night, she heard faint whispers, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. She told herself it was her imagination, but the feeling of unease only grew. One evening, while brushing her hair in front of the mirror, Anna froze. In the reflection, she saw a woman standing behind her, her face twisted in rage. Anna spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, her own reflection stared back, pale and terrified. Her heart raced as she took a step back, her hands trembling. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered. The mirror didn't respond, but Anna knew she wasn't alone. Something or someone was in there, and it wasn't going to let her go. Anna's apartment had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of the world. But since the mirror arrived, it had become a prison of shadows and whispers. The atmosphere shifted subtly, at first a chill in the air that the heater couldn't fix, a faint hum that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in work and distractions, but the unease grew with each passing day. The mirror became the focal point of her torment. It no longer felt like an object, but something alive, something that observed her every move. She avoided looking at it directly, but she could feel its presence, a heavy weight pressing against her chest. Sometimes, when she walked past it, she caught a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, but when she turned, the glass was still. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Nights were the worst. She'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the whispers would start. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually they became clearer. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable anger, resentment, a simmering rage that made her skin crawl. Once, she swore she heard her name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien. The mirror's influence began to seep into her waking hours. Objects in her apartment moved on their own, a book falling from a shelf, a chair scraping across the floor when no one was near it. She'd find doors open when she was certain she'd closed them, and the air would grow so cold that her breath formed clouds. She tried to rationalize it, blaming drafts or faulty wiring, but deep down, she knew the mirror was responsible. One afternoon, while cleaning, Anna noticed something strange. The mirror's surface, once slightly clouded, now seemed to ripple like water. She approached it cautiously, her reflection warping and shifting as though it were being pushed and pulled by invisible hands. She reached out to touch the glass, and the moment her fingers made contact, a searing pain shot up her arm. She yanked her hand back, staring at her trembling fingers. There were no marks, no burns, but the pain lingered. That evening, she tried to cover the mirror with a sheet, hoping to block out whatever was trapped inside. But the sheet wouldn't stay. No matter how tightly she tucked it in, it would slide off as though pushed by unseen hands. She even tried turning the mirror to face the wall, but when she woke the next morning, it was back in its original position, the sheet neatly folded at its base. The nightmares began soon after. They were vivid, more real than any dream she'd ever had. In them, she was trapped in a dark, endless hallway lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different version of herself, some twisted and monstrous, others broken and weeping. At the end of the hallway, the woman from the mirror waited, her face a mask of fury. She would reach out, her fingers long and clawed, and just as she touched Anna would wake up, drenched in sweat. By the second week, Anna began to feel the physical toll. Her skin was pale, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. She avoided eating because the sight of food made her nauseous, and she jumped at every sound. Her friends noticed the change, but she brushed off their concerns, claiming she was just stressed from work. She couldn't tell them the truth that she was being haunted by a mirror. The breaking point came one night when she heard laughter. It was soft and melodic, but there was a cruel edge to it that made her blood run cold. She followed the sound to the mirror and froze. The woman in the reflection was staring back at her, her eyes gleaming with malice. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect, and whispered, "You can't escape me." Anna stumbled back, her mind reeling. She wanted to scream, to smash the mirror into 1,000 pieces, but she couldn't move. The woman's laughter echoed in her ears, filling the room until it was deafening. When Anna finally found her voice, she whispered, "What do you want from me?" The mirror didn't answer, but Anna knew this was just the beginning. Whatever was in the mirror, it wasn't finished with her. Anna's days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and fear. The mirror's presence loomed over her, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone in her home. The visions grew more frequent, more vivid, each one chipping away at her sanity. It started with fleeting glimpses, a shadow moving in the reflection, a hand brushing against the glass. But soon, the woman in the mirror began to appear in full, her face contorted with rage and sorrow. One evening, Anna sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the mirror despite the dread it stirred in her. The room was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, the glass rippled like water, and the woman stepped forward, her eyes locked on Anna's. She wore a tattered dress that might have been elegant once, and her hair hung in lifeless strands around her face. Anna tried to look away, but she was transfixed, her body frozen in place. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her gestures were sharp and deliberate, as though she was trying to communicate something important. Anna's heart pounded as she watched, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, the woman raised her hand and pointed at Anna, her expression shifting from anger to pain. Tears streamed down her face, and she mouthed the words, "Help me." Anna woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see the woman still there, but it was just her own reflection staring back. The encounter felt so real, so visceral, that she could still feel the weight of the woman's gaze. She climbed out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment, trying to chase away the shadows that seemed to gather in every corner. The visions became more intrusive, invading not just her sleep but her waking hours. While washing dishes, she saw the woman's face in the soap bubbles. When she turned on the TV, static filled the screen, and the woman's voice whispered through the speakers. Once, while walking to work, she caught a glimpse of the woman in a car's tinted window, her hand pressed against the glass as though she was trying to escape. Anna began to question her own sanity. Was she hallucinating? Or was the spirit in the mirror somehow influencing her mind? She tried to convince herself it was stress, that her imagination was running wild, but deep down, she knew the truth. The woman in the mirror was real, and she wasn't going to let Anna forget it. One night, the visions reached a terrifying climax. Anna was standing in front of the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass, when the surface turned liquid. Her fingers sank into it, and before she could pull back, the woman grabbed her wrist. Her grip was icy and unyielding, her nails digging into Anna's skin. Anna tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman leaned in close, her breath cold against Anna's face, and whispered, "You are mine." Anna yanked her hand free, stumbling back and falling to the floor. She stared at the mirror, her heart racing, but the glass was solid once more. Her wrist ached, and when she looked down, she saw faint red marks where the woman's fingers had been. The next morning, Anna decided she couldn't ignore the visions any longer. She needed answers, even if it meant confronting the spirit directly. She stood in front of the mirror, her reflection pale and tired, and asked, "Who are you?" The glass rippled, and the woman appeared, her expression softer this time. She mouthed a name, but Anna couldn't hear it. Feeling braver, Anna pressed her hand to the glass again. The surface shimmered, and for a moment, she felt a connection, a rush of emotions that weren't her own. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, they flooded her mind, overwhelming her senses. She pulled back, gasping for air, and the woman's face twisted in pain. As the days passed, Anna began to piece together fragments of the woman's story. She wasn't just a random spirit, she was tied to the mirror, bound by a curse that had lasted generations. But why had she chosen Anna? What did she want? The visions were a warning, a cry for help, and Anna knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. Whatever darkness was trapped in the mirror, she had to face it no matter the cost. Anna spent the next few days in a fog, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The mirror loomed in her bedroom, its presence a constant, oppressive reminder of the spirit trapped within. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, afraid of her own reflection, jumping at every sound. If she was going to break free from the mirror's grip, she needed to understand its history. Her first step was to visit the antique shop where she'd bought the mirror. The elderly shopkeeper had warned her about its history, and Anna hoped she had more information. But when she arrived, the shop was closed, a handwritten sign on the door reading, "Gone indefinitely." Anna knocked on the door, peering through the dusty windows, but the interior was dark and empty. The shopkeeper had vanished, leaving Anna with no leads. Determined not to give up, Anna turned to the internet. She searched for information about cursed mirrors, haunted objects, and local legends, but the results were overwhelming and mostly unreliable. Then, she remembered the shopkeeper mentioning the mirror's origin, her hometown. Anna hadn't been back since she was a child, but she knew it was her best chance at finding answers. She called her mother, who still lived in the town, and asked about the mirror. At first, her mother was hesitant, brushing off Anna's questions as idle curiosity. But when Anna described the mirror in detail, the ornate silver frame, the intricate carvings, her mother grew quiet. "That mirror belonged to your great-great-grandmother," she finally said. "Her name was Eliza. She was a troubled woman." Anna's heart skipped a beat. This was the break she'd been waiting for. She pressed her mother for more information, but her mother refused to say much over the phone. "If you really want to know, come home," she said. "But be careful, Anna. Some things are better left buried." The next morning, Anna packed a bag and drove to her hometown, a quiet, sleepy village surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. It hadn't changed much since she was a child, and the familiarity brought a strange mix of comfort and unease. She checked into a small inn on the edge of town, then went to visit her mother. Her mother's house was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of fresh bread and lavender. But the atmosphere grew tense when Anna brought up the mirror. Her mother sat her down at the kitchen table and told her the story of Eliza. Eliza was accused of witchcraft. Her mother began, her voice low and serious. The townspeople said she cursed her own family, that she brought death and destruction wherever she went. They turned on her, and one night, they murdered her in her own home. The mirror was the only thing left behind. Anna listened, her stomach churning. The story explained the spirit's anger, her pain, but it didn't explain why she had chosen Anna. Her mother hesitated, then added, "There's something else." Eliza's curse was said to bind her spirit to the mirror. She's been trapped there ever since, waiting for someone to set her free. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" she asked. Her mother sighed, her eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want you to believe in it. I thought if I kept it hidden, it would stay buried. But now that you have the mirror, I'm afraid you're part of this, Anna." The weight of her mother's words settled over Anna like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just dealing with a haunted mirror, she was dealing with a family curse. The spirit in the mirror wasn't a random ghost. She was Anna's ancestor, bound to the mirror by a legacy of pain and betrayal. "What should I do?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "You need to break the curse, Anna. But be careful. Freeing her might come at a cost." Anna left her mother's house that evening, her mind reeling. She didn't know how to break the curse, but she knew she had to try. The mirror wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a part of her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Anna spent the night at the inn, her mind racing with thoughts of Eliza and the curse. She knew she needed to learn more about her ancestor, but her mother's account only scratched the surface. The next morning, she decided to visit the town's historical society, hoping to find records or documents that could shed light on Eliza's life. The historical society was housed in a small, unassuming building on the edge of town. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The woman at the desk, a friendly retiree named Margaret, greeted Anna warmly and offered to help with her research. When Anna mentioned Eliza's name, Margaret's expression darkened. "That's a name we don't hear often around here," she said. "But I'll see what I can find." Margaret led Anna to a room filled with shelves of old books, photographs, and documents. She returned a few minutes later with a dusty, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Eliza," Margaret said, handing it to Anna. "It's the only surviving record of her life. Be careful with it, it's fragile." Anna took the journal to a table and opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink faded to a pale brown. As she read, Eliza's voice came to life, her words filled with pain, defiance, and a deep sense of injustice. She wrote about the town's suspicion of her, the way they whispered behind her back and blamed her for every misfortune. One entry stood out, dated just days before her death. "They call me a witch, but I am no such thing. I am a healer, a woman who uses the gifts of the earth to help others. But they fear what they do not understand. Last night, they came to my home, accusing me of cursing their crops. I tried to reason with them, but they would not listen. I fear what they will do next." Anna's heart ached as she read Eliza's words. She was a woman wronged, a victim of ignorance and fear. The journal became a window into her ancestor's soul, and Anna felt a growing connection to her. She wasn't just a spirit in a mirror. She was a woman who had suffered deeply, whose story had been erased by time. As the afternoon wore on, Anna found another entry, this one more cryptic. "The mirror holds a secret, a way to break the bonds that trap me. But the cost is great, and I fear it will consume anyone who tries. I will hide the truth, so that no one else must suffer. If you find this, know that the mirror is more than it seems. It is a prison, a portal, and a curse. Anna's hands trembled as she closed the journal. Eliza had left clues, hints about how to break the curse, but they were vague and unsettling. Anna knew she had to continue her research, but she also felt a growing sense of dread. Breaking the curse might require more than she was willing to give. That evening, Anna returned to the inn, the journal tucked safely in her bag. She sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, and wondered what Eliza had meant by the cost. Was she talking about a sacrifice? A life for a life? The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She spent the next few days combing through the town's archives, searching for any mention of Eliza or the mirror. She found old newspaper articles about the trial, which painted Eliza as a villain, a woman who had brought ruin to the town. The articles were biased and cruel, and Anna felt a surge of anger on behalf of her ancestor. One article mentioned the mirror as evidence of Eliza's witchcraft, claiming it was used to summon dark forces. Another spoke of the townspeople's fear of the mirror, how they refused to touch it after Eliza's death. Anna began to piece together the story. The mirror wasn't just a cursed object. It was a symbol of the town's guilt, a relic of their sins. By the end of the week, Anna had gathered as much information as she could. She knew Eliza's story, the events that led to her death, and the curse that bound her to the mirror. But she still didn't know how to break it. The journal hinted at a solution, but the answer remained frustratingly out of reach. As Anna prepared to leave the town and return home, she felt a strange sense of closure. She hadn't broken the curse yet, but she had reclaimed a piece of her family's history. Eliza's story was no longer buried, and Anna was determined to honor her memory by setting her free. Anna returned home with Eliza's journal and a renewed sense of purpose. The mirror waited for her in the bedroom, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. She placed the journal on the table and sat down, her heart pounding as she prepared to confront the spirit. She knew she couldn't keep running from the mirror. It was time to face the curse head-on. She opened the journal to the entry about the mirror's secret, reading it again and again, searching for any clues she might have missed. The words were cryptic, filled with references to rituals and sacrifices, but one phrase stood out: the key lies in the reflection. Anna wondered what it meant. Was she supposed to look into the mirror? Or was there something hidden in her own reflection? That night, Anna stood in front of the mirror, her hands pressed against the cold glass. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Eliza, I'm here to help you." The surface rippled, and the woman appeared, her expression softer than before. She nodded, as if acknowledging Anna's words, then pointed to the journal on the table. Anna grabbed the book and flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain Eliza's gesture. She found a diagram near the end, a circle with symbols drawn around the edges. Beneath it was a list of ingredients: candles, salt, herbs, and a lock of hair. Anna's stomach dropped as she realized what it was: a ritual to break the curse. She spent the next day gathering the items, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. The ritual seemed straightforward, but the journal warned of the risks. "The curse cannot be broken without sacrifice," it read. "The mirror demands a price, and only the brave can pay it." Anna tried not to think about what it might mean, focusing instead on the task at hand. As the sun set, Anna drew the circle on the floor, carefully placing the candles and herbs around the edges. She lit the candles, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She stepped inside the circle, holding the lock of her hair, and began to recite the incantation. The words felt foreign on her tongue, their rhythm strange and unsettling. As she spoke, the mirror began to glow, its surface pulsing with a faint, silvery light. Eliza's reflection appeared, her eyes wide with both hope and fear. Anna's voice grew stronger, more confident, as she continued the chant, her heart racing with anticipation. Suddenly, the room went cold. The candles flickered and dimmed, their flames shrinking to mere embers. Anna felt a presence behind her, a shadow moving in the corner of her eye. She turned, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, Eliza was gone, replaced by a swirling fog that filled the glass. From the fog emerged a figure, tall and menacing, its features blurred and shifting. It stepped closer, its form solidifying. Until Anna could see its face, it was Eliza, but not the woman from the mirror. This version of her was twisted, her eyes black and her smile cruel. She reached out, her fingers curling into claws, and hissed, "You cannot break the curse." Anna stumbled back, the incantation faltering on her lips. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "The mirror demands a price," it said, its voice echoing in the room. "If you want to free her, you must take her place." Anna's heart pounded as the figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. She looked at the mirror, desperate for help, but Eliza's reflection was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, the room went silent. The candles flared back to life, the light overwhelming and bright. The figure vanished, and the mirror returned to normal, its surface still and unbroken. Anna collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know if the ritual had worked, but she knew one thing: the curse wasn't broken yet. As she sat there, trying to catch her breath, she noticed something on the floor. It was a scrap of paper, covered in Eliza's handwriting. She picked it up and read the words, "The key lies in the reflection. Look within, and you will find the truth." Anna stared at the note, her mind racing. What did it mean? Was the answer inside her all along? She didn't have time to think about it. The air around her grew thick and heavy, and she felt a familiar presence, the spirit of the mirror, watching her, waiting. Anna knew she was running out of time. She had to find the key to breaking the curse, or she would lose herself to the mirror forever. Anna sat in the circle for what felt like hours, the scrap of paper clutched in her hand. "The key lies in the reflection," Eliza's words echoed in her mind. She stared at the mirror, its surface now calm and unbroken, but its presence loomed larger than ever. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of her, waiting to be discovered. She stood slowly, her legs shaky from exhaustion, and approached the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, familiar yet somehow different. There was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. She reached out and touched the glass, half expecting it to ripple or shift, but it remained solid. As she gazed into the mirror, she began to notice details she had overlooked before. The frame, once ornate and beautiful, was marred by tiny cracks and imperfections. The carvings around the edges were intricate, depicting symbols she couldn't decipher but felt oddly drawn to. She ran her fingers over the frame, tracing the patterns, and felt a faint vibration beneath her skin. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and whispered, "Eliza, I'm trying to understand. Help me." The room grew colder, and the air seemed to hum with energy. The mirror's surface shimmered, and Eliza's reflection appeared, her expression calm and focused. She pointed to the frame, then to Anna, her movements deliberate. Anna knelt in front of the mirror, her eyes scanning the carvings. She noticed one symbol that stood out, a small, intricate design near the bottom of the frame. It looked like a spiral, its lines twisting and curling into themselves. She pressed her finger against it, and the spiral glowed faintly, a soft blue light emanating from within. The room shifted, the walls fading away as a vision overtook her. She was standing in a small, dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of herbs and candle wax. A woman, Eliza, stood at a table, her hands moving quickly as she carved the same spiral into a piece of wood. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with determination. "The key lies in the reflection," Eliza said, her voice echoing in the vision. "To break the curse, you must see what I could not. You must face the truth, no matter how painful it is." The vision faded, and Anna found herself back in her bedroom, the mirror silent and still once more. She sat on the floor, her mind racing. Eliza had left her a message, a clue hidden in the mirror's frame. The spiral was more than just a symbol, it was a key, a way to unlock the truth behind the curse. But what truth was Anna supposed to face? What had Eliza been unable to see? She returned to the journal, flipping through the pages for any mention of the spiral. She found a rough sketch of the symbol, accompanied by a note. The spiral represents the eternal cycle, the connection between this world and the next. It is a gateway, a way to see beyond the veil. Anna's heart skipped a beat. If the spiral was a gateway, then perhaps it could help her communicate with Eliza directly. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to venture beyond the mirror's surface. She knew it was dangerous, but she had no other choice. She set up the circle again, this time placing the mirror in the center. She lit the candles, their flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. She pressed her finger to the spiral, its glow intensifying as she whispered the incantation from the journal. The room grew colder, the air thick with anticipation. The mirror's surface rippled, and Anna felt a pull, a force drawing her in. She resisted at first, her instincts screaming at her to stop, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, her reflection blurring and shifting until it was no longer her own. As she reached out to touch the glass, the room went dark, and she felt herself falling, tumbling into the mirror's depths. The last thing she saw was Eliza's face, her eyes filled with both hope and sorrow. Anna knew she had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. Anna opened her eyes to a world that was both familiar and strange. She stood in a dimly lit hallway, its walls lined with faded portraits and dusty mirrors. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and damp earth, and the silence was so profound it felt oppressive. She took a cautious step forward, her footsteps echoing softly. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows shifting and twisting as she moved. She glanced at the portraits, their faces worn and blurry, but one caught her eye, a woman with piercing eyes and a haunted expression. It was Eliza, her features sharper and more vivid than in the mirror. Anna reached out to touch the frame, but it disintegrated into ash at her fingertips. She pressed on, the air growing colder with each step. The hallway led to a large ornate door, its surface covered in carvings that mirrored the symbols on the mirror's frame. She pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with flickering candles and the scent of burning herbs. In the center of the room stood Eliza, her back turned to Anna. "You came," Eliza said, her voice soft and melodic. She turned to face Anna, her expression calm but tinged with sadness. "I wasn't sure if you would have the courage to follow me here." Anna hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had so many questions, but now that she was face to face with Eliza, she felt overwhelmed. "I'm here to help you," Anna finally said, her voice trembling. "I want to break the curse, to set you free." Eliza smiled, but there was no joy in it. "The curse is not so easily broken," she replied. "It is tied to my soul, and to free me, you must face the truth of what happened." Anna nodded, though she didn't fully understand. "What truth?" she asked. Eliza gestured to the candles, their flames dancing wildly. "The truth of my life, and the lies that led to my death," she said. "To break the curse, you must see what I saw, feel what I felt." Before Anna could respond, the room began to shift. The walls melted away, replaced by the streets of the village as it had been centuries ago. The air was filled with the sounds of people shouting, their voices angry and accusing. Anna watched as a crowd gathered in the square, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. In the center of the crowd stood Eliza, her head held high despite the anger directed at her. The townspeople accused her of witchcraft, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. Eliza tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't listen. Anna watched in horror as they dragged her away, their faces filled with malice. The scene shifted again, and Anna found herself standing outside Eliza's home. The windows were dark, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and ash. She saw Eliza inside, her hands trembling as she carved the spiral into the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with determination. "The mirror was my last hope," Eliza said, her voice echoing in the room. "I bound my spirit to it, hoping that one day someone would find it and set me free. But the curse is strong, and breaking it will require more than you realize." Anna felt a surge of anger, not at Eliza, but at the people who had wronged her. "They didn't understand you," she said. "They were afraid of what they couldn't control." Eliza nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Fear can make people cruel," she said. "But your courage gives me hope." The room began to fade, the walls dissolving into shadows. Eliza reached out and took Anna's hand, her touch cold but comforting. "The key lies in the reflection," she said. "To break the curse, you must face your own fears, your own truths. The mirror will show you what you need to see, but it will not be easy." Anna felt a tug, a force pulling her back toward the mirror's surface. She tried to hold on, but the world around her was dissolving, slipping through her fingers. As she was pulled back into the waking world, she heard Eliza's voice one last time. "Remember, the truth is the key." When Anna opened her eyes, she was back in her bedroom, the mirror silent and still before her. Her heart was racing, her mind filled with images of Eliza's life and the cruelty she had endured. She knew what she had to do, but the thought filled her with dread. The mirror would show her the truth, but it would be a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Anna sat in front of the mirror, her hands trembling as she stared into its depths. Eliza's words echoed in her mind, "The key lies in the reflection." She knew what she had to do, but the thought of facing her own truths filled her with dread. The mirror had shown Eliza's pain, her suffering, but now it would show Anna her own. She took a deep breath, her eyes locked on the mirror's surface. The room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier as she whispered, "Show me the truth." The mirror rippled, its surface shimmering like water, and Anna felt a strange pull, as if it were drawing her in. She resisted the urge to look away, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection shifted, and Anna saw herself, but it wasn't the girl she knew. This version of her was older, her face lined with worry and regret. She sat alone in a dimly lit room, her eyes staring at nothing, her hands clenched into fists. Anna's stomach churned as she realized this was a glimpse of her future, a life filled with loneliness and unfulfilled dreams. The image faded, replaced by another. This time, she saw herself as a child, standing in a field of tall grass. She was laughing, her joy radiating from her like sunlight. But then the scene changed, and she saw her mother's face, etched with disappointment. "You'll never be good enough," her mother's voice said, the words cutting deep. Anna felt a lump in her throat, the memory of those words still raw after all these years. The mirror showed her more her fears, her insecurities, the moments she had tried to forget. She saw herself failing at school, her friends drifting away, and the dreams she had abandoned out of fear. It was as if the mirror was stripping away the layers she had built around herself, exposing the truth she had buried deep inside. Tears streamed down Anna's face as she watched, her chest tight with emotion. She wanted to look away, to escape the mirror's unrelenting gaze, but she forced herself to keep watching. She knew this was the only way to break the curse, to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The reflection shifted again, and this time she saw Eliza, her face gentle and understanding. "The truth is hard to face," Eliza said, her voice soft and soothing. "But it is the only way to free yourself from the chains that bind you. The mirror doesn't just show you your past, it shows you what you need to see to move forward." Anna wiped her tears, her hands shaking. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza smiled, her expression filled with warmth. "You accept it," she said. "You accept who you are, with all your flaws and fears. The mirror shows you the truth, but it is up to you to decide what to do with it." The image of Eliza faded, and Anna was left staring at her own reflection. She saw herself as she was, her hair messy, her eyes red from crying, her face pale and tired. But there was something else, a resilience in her eyes that she hadn't noticed before. She realized that the mirror hadn't just shown her her fears, it had shown her her strength. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She knew now that the curse wasn't just about Eliza, it was about her, too. The mirror had been a mirror all along, reflecting not just Eliza's pain but her own. Breaking the curse meant breaking free from the fears that had held her back. She stood, her legs shaky but determined. She reached out and touched the mirror's surface, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady. She didn't know if Eliza could hear her, but it didn't matter. She had faced the truth, and she was ready to move forward. The mirror's surface rippled, and for a moment, she thought she saw Eliza's reflection smiling back at her. Then the room grew still, the air lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Anna knew the curse wasn't broken yet, but she had taken the first step. She had faced her truth, and now she was ready to face whatever came next. Anna stood in front of the mirror one last time, her heart steady and her resolve firm. She knew what she had to do. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to break the curse, not just for Eliza, but for herself. She placed her hands on the mirror's frame, her fingers tracing the spiral symbol, and whispered, "It's time." The air grew heavy, the room seeming to hold its breath as the mirror's surface shimmered and rippled. Eliza's reflection appeared, her expression calm but tinged with sorrow. "Are you ready?" Eliza asked, her voice soft and filled with gratitude. Anna nodded, her eyes locked on Eliza's. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's end this." Eliza reached out, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to bridge the gap between their worlds. "The curse can only be broken by sacrifice," she said. "But it's not what you think. You don't have to give up your life, you have already given something far more precious. You've given your fear, your doubts, your pain. That is the sacrifice the mirror demands." Anna's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The mirror hadn't just shown her her fears, it had forced her to confront them, to let them go. The sacrifice wasn't about losing something tangible, it was about surrendering the parts of herself that had held her back. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a deep sense of relief, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. The room began to change, the walls dissolving into a swirl of light and shadow. The mirror's surface glowed brightly, its light filling the space with a warmth that seemed to cradle Anna like a cocoon. She felt Eliza's presence beside her, her spirit no longer bound by the glass but free to move through the world. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You've done what I could not. You've faced the truth, and in doing so, you've freed us both." Anna reached out, her hand brushing against Eliza's, and felt a surge of connection, a bond forged through shared pain and shared strength. The light grew brighter, enveloping everything in its glow. Anna closed her eyes, her heart pounding but her mind at peace. She felt the mirror's curse unraveling, its power dissolving into the light. When she opened her eyes, the room was still, the mirror silent and still. Its surface was clear and unbroken, but it no longer held the weight it once had. Eliza was gone, her spirit finally at rest. Anna stood alone in the room, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt lighter, freer, as if she had shed a skin she hadn't realized she was wearing. She looked at the mirror one last time, its surface reflecting only her face, calm, steady, and filled with a quiet strength. She turned away, leaving the mirror behind, and stepped out into the morning light. The air was crisp and fresh, the world vibrant and alive. She felt a sense of renewal, as if she had been given a second chance. She knew the journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had faced her fears, confronted the truth, and emerged stronger for it. As she walked away from the house, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The mirror had been a curse, but it had also been a gift, a chance to see herself clearly, to let go of the past and embrace the future. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. The mirror remained in the house, its surface still and unbroken, its curse finally lifted. It was no longer a prison, but a relic of a story that had come to an end. Anna didn't look back. She walked forward, her heart light and her spirit free, knowing that she had found the key not just to Eliza's freedom, but to her own. The mirror of the soul. The rain fell in a steady drizzle as Maria hurried down the cobblestone streets, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. She had been wandering the city aimlessly, seeking inspiration for her next painting, when she noticed a narrow alley she had never seen before. At its end stood an old, crooked building with a sign that read, Antigüedades del Pasado, Antiques of the Past. The shop's windows were fogged with age, and the faint glow of a single lamp beckoned her inside. Pushing the creaking door open, Maria was greeted by the scent of dust and old wood. The shop was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures, ancient clocks, cracked porcelain dolls, and shelves stacked with yellowed books. Her fingers traced the edges of a gilded picture frame as she moved deeper into the shop, her curiosity piqued. At the back of the room, something caught her eye, a full-length mirror leaning against the wall. Its frame was intricately carved with twisting vines and strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The glass itself was pristine, untouched by time, and it radiated an odd energy that made her pulse quicken. Maria stepped closer, drawn to it as if by some unseen force. As she examined the mirror, she noticed a faint inscription along the bottom edge. It was in a language she didn't recognize, but the words sent a shiver down her spine. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a slow, deliberate manner, appeared from the shadows. "Ah, I see you found Esposito," he said, his voice gravelly and soft. Maria turned to him, her curiosity outweighing her unease. "It's beautiful. Where did it come from?" The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on the mirror. "It has a long history," he said cryptically. "But I must warn you, this mirror is not for the faint of heart. It has a presence." Maria laughed nervously, brushing off his warning. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said. The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Belief is not required for something to be real," he replied. She rolled her eyes, dismissing his words as the ramblings of an old man trying to sell his wares. "How much is it?" she asked, already reaching for her wallet. The man hesitated again, studying her as if weighing her fate. "For you, 70 euros, he said finally. Maria handed him the money, a thrill of excitement coursing through her as the mirror became hers. As she left the shop, the rain had stopped, but the air felt heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. By the time she returned to her small apartment, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the room. Maria propped the mirror against the wall in her living room, stepping back to admire it. The mirror seemed to warp the light, making the room feel colder, darker. Yet, Maria couldn't look away. It was as if the mirror had a gravity of its own, pulling her into its depths. She shook her head, chiding herself for being so fanciful. "It's just a mirror," she muttered, turning away to make herself a cup of tea. Later that night, as she sat on the couch with her sketchbook, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror. For a moment, it seemed like someone else was staring back at her, someone with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. Maria blinked, and the image was gone. She sighed, blaming her exhaustion and overactive imagination. But as she climbed into bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The mirror stood silent and still in the corner of the room, its surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Maria turned her back to it, pulling the blankets tightly around her. Little did she know, the mirror's presence was far from benign. The spirit within had been waiting for someone like Maria to bring it back to life. And now, it had her. Maria woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the morning light spilling into her apartment. She stretched, trying to shake off the unease that had lingered from the night before. Her eyes drifted to the mirror, still leaning against the wall where she'd left it. It seemed ordinary in the daylight, its carved frame elegant but unremarkable. She told herself she'd been imagining things, that the stress of her artist's block was getting to her. Later that afternoon, Maria stood in front of the mirror, holding up a dress she'd been thinking of painting. She turned slightly, admiring the way the fabric caught the light, but something about her reflection felt off. Her face looked sharper, her eyes darker, as if a shadow had settled over her features. She frowned, leaning closer to the glass, but the moment she did, the reflection shifted, its lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. Maria stumbled back, her heart racing. She blinked hard, shaking her head. "Stop it," she muttered to herself. "You're just tired." She turned away from the mirror, trying to ignore the cold sweat prickling her skin. For the rest of the day, she busied herself with chores, avoiding the mirror as much as possible. But it was impossible to ignore entirely. Every time she passed it, she felt its pull, as if it were silently calling her. That evening, she found herself staring at it again, mesmerized by the way the light played on its surface. This time, her reflection seemed normal, and she began to relax. Maybe it had all been in her head. The next morning, however, the strange occurrences returned. As she brushed her hair, her reflection moved a second too late, its hand lifting just after hers. Maria froze, her breath catching in her throat. She dropped the brush, and the reflection did the same. But the sound of it hitting the floor didn't come from the mirror, it came from behind her. Whirling around, she saw the brush lying on the floor, as if it had fallen from the mirror itself. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away, her eyes darting between the mirror and the brush. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed her phone, her first instinct to call someone, but who would believe her? Days passed, and the mirror's presence grew more oppressive. Maria began to notice small changes in her reflection. Its eyes seemed to follow her, its expression growing colder with each passing day. At night, she swore she could hear faint whispers coming from the glass, though no matter how hard she listened, she couldn't make out the words. One evening, as she sat on the couch with a book, she caught a glimpse of her reflection out of the corner of her eye. It was staring directly at her, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Maria dropped the book, her heart pounding as she turned to face the mirror. The reflection was normal now, but she could feel its malice lingering in the air, as if it were taunting her. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a blanket, she threw it over the mirror, desperate to block it from her sight. But even then, she could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight in the room. That night, she slept with the lights on, the blanket-covered mirror looming in the corner like a silent, malevolent watcher. The next morning, Maria woke to find the blanket on the floor, the mirror uncovered. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, her fear giving way to anger. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty apartment. The mirror gave no answer, its surface shimmering faintly, as if mocking her. Exhausted and terrified, Maria decided she needed answers. She grabbed her laptop and began researching the mirror, determined to uncover its history. What she found would only deepen her fear: a series of articles about strange occurrences linked to the mirror, each more disturbing than the last. By the time she closed her laptop, Maria knew she was in over her head. The mirror wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had its sights set on her. She needed to find a way to stop it before it was too late. But as she glanced at the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already one step ahead of her. The dreams began that same night. Maria drifted off to sleep, exhausted from days of unease, only to find herself standing in a dark, unfamiliar forest. The trees were twisted and skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The air was thick with fog, and a cold wind whispered through the underbrush, carrying with it the scent of decay. She knew she was dreaming, yet the terror felt all too real. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct but undeniably human. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its footsteps silent on the damp earth. Maria tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey, rooted to the spot as if by some unseen force. The figure drew closer, its features coming into view: hollow eyes, a mouth twisted into a cruel smile, and a face that was somehow both familiar and alien. "Let go," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated in her mind. Maria woke with a start, her heart pounding and her sheets soaked with sweat. She glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind her, but it was silent and still. She told herself it was just a dream, but the fear lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. The next night, the dream returned, but this time the forest was different. The trees were thicker, their branches entwined to form a suffocating canopy. The figure was waiting for her, its presence more oppressive than before. It didn't speak this time, but its eyes bore into hers, filled with a hunger that made her blood run cold. Maria ran, her feet sinking into the soft earth, but no matter how fast she moved, the figure remained just behind her, its breath cold on the back of her neck. When she woke this time, she found scratches on her arms, thin and bleeding as if made by nails. She stared at them in disbelief, her mind racing. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the evidence was there, undeniable and horrifying. The dream was no longer just a dream, it was something more, something real. The following nights were worse. The figure grew bolder, its presence more tangible. It began to speak, its voice a cacophony of whispers that filled her waking hours. "Let go," it would say, over and over, the words echoing in her mind until she thought she would go mad. Maria tried to stay awake, desperate to avoid the nightmares, but exhaustion always claimed her, dragging her back into the forest. One night, the dream changed. The forest faded away, replaced by her apartment. The mirror was there, but it was different. The glass was black, like a void, and the frame pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its form solid and tangible, and Maria realized with mounting horror that it wasn't just a figure anymore. It was her. The doppelganger stared at her with hollow eyes, its smile growing wider with every passing second. "Why do you fight?" it asked, its voice a perfect imitation of hers. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted. All you have to do is let go." Maria backed away, her chest heaving, but the doppelganger followed, its movements unervingly smooth. When she woke, the room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. The mirror loomed in the corner, its surface shimmering faintly. She could feel its presence, a malevolent force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. Maria knew she couldn't keep going like this. The dreams were tearing her apart, wearing her down until there would be nothing left. Desperate for answers, she began to research the mirror again, this time delving deeper into its history. She uncovered stories of previous owners who had gone mad or vanished without a trace, their fates eerily similar to what she was experiencing. The mirror, it seemed, had a taste for souls, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed hers. Maria knew she couldn't fight this alone. She needed help, someone who understood what she was dealing with. As she scrolled through her phone, her eyes landed on a name she'd bookmarked days earlier, a paranormal investigator who specialized in haunted objects. With trembling hands, she sent him a message, hoping it wasn't already too late. That night, the nightmare returned, but this time it was worse than ever. The doppelganger was waiting for her, its face a grotesque mirror of her own. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice filled with venom. "You belong to me now." Maria woke screaming, the echo of its words ringing in her ears. She knew she was running out of time. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Maria sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. The mirror stood in the corner, its surface glinting in the pale light. She could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive weight that seemed to fill the room. But she wouldn't give up. She would fight, no matter what it took. The morning after the worst of her nightmares, Maria received a response from the paranormal investigator, Dr. Elias Mendoza. He agreed to meet her at her apartment later that day, his tone serious and urgent. Maria felt a flicker of hope, though it was overshadowed by the growing sense of dread that had become her constant companion. She spent the morning cleaning up, trying to distract herself from the mirror's oppressive presence, but every time she glanced at it, she could feel its malevolence seeping into the room. When Dr. Mendoza arrived, he was not what Maria had expected. He was a tall, wiry man in his late 40s, with sharp features and piercing dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He carried a worn leather satchel filled with what he called his tools of the trade: cameras, audio recorders, and a variety of strange devices Maria didn't recognize. After a brief introduction, he went straight to the mirror, his expression growing more somber as he examined it. "This is an antique," he said, running a gloved hand over the frame. "Late 17th century, if I had to guess. And these symbols," he paused, frowning as he studied the carvings. "They're not decorative. They're wards, meant to contain something. Or someone." Maria felt a chill run down her spine but nodded for him to continue. Dr. Mendoza explained that the mirror was likely a vessel, designed to trap a malevolent entity and prevent it from causing harm. But something had gone wrong. He set up his equipment around the room, placing cameras and microphones in strategic locations to capture any supernatural activity. Maria watched nervously as he worked, her eyes darting to the mirror every few seconds. Dr. Mendoza noticed her unease and offered a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out," he said. "But you need to be honest with me. Tell me everything, no matter how strange it seems." Maria recounted her experiences, from the distorted reflections to the nightmares and the physical manifestations. Dr. Mendoza listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in a worn notebook. By the time she finished, his expression was grave. "This is worse than I thought," he admitted. "The mirror isn't just haunted, it's alive, and it's feeding on you. If we don't act soon, it will consume you entirely." He proposed a ritual to sever the mirror's connection to her, but it would require time and preparation. In the meantime, he instructed her to avoid looking into the mirror and to spend as little time in the apartment as possible. Maria nodded, relief and fear warring within her. She trusted Dr. Mendoza, but the mirror's presence was growing stronger, and she wasn't sure she could hold out long enough. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. Maria found herself in the dark forest again, the figure waiting for her as always. But this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows surrounded her, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. The figure stepped forward, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You belong to me now." Maria woke screaming, her body drenched in sweat. The room was freezing, and she could feel the mirror's presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. She grabbed her phone and called Dr. Mendoza, her voice trembling as she recounted the dream. He promised to come over as soon as possible, but until then, she needed to stay strong. When he arrived, he brought with him a small vial of holy water and a silver cross on a chain. He handed the cross to Maria, instructing her to wear it at all times. "It won't stop the mirror," he said, "but it might buy us some time." He then began to prepare for the ritual, laying out candles, incense, and a series of strange, chalk-like symbols on the floor around the mirror. As he worked, Maria felt a growing sense of unease. The mirror seemed to pulse with energy, its surface shimmering faintly as if it knew what they were trying to do. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, their edges blurring as if they were alive. Dr. Mendoza paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied the mirror. "It's fighting us," he said, "but we can't stop now." He lit the candles and began to chant in a language Maria didn't recognize. The words seemed to hang in the air, their resonance filling the room. The mirror shuddered, its surface rippling like water, and Maria felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. She clutched the cross tighter, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Just as the ritual seemed to be reaching its climax, the mirror let out a deafening crack, its surface splitting down the middle. A cold, dark wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the candles and knocking Dr. Mendoza to the floor. Maria screamed as the shadows seemed to converge on the mirror, their forms twisting and merging into something monstrous. When the wind subsided, the room was silent. The mirror stood in the corner, its surface unbroken, as if nothing had happened. Dr. Mendoza got to his feet, his face pale and drawn. "It's stronger than I thought," he said. "We'll need to try again. But next time, we won't hold back." Maria nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the mirror wasn't done with her, and neither was the darkness it held. The next day, Dr. Mendoza returned with reinforcements, a medium named Sophia, who claimed to have dealt with haunted objects before. Maria watched as the two of them prepared for the second attempt at the ritual, her anxiety growing with every passing minute. The mirror loomed in the corner of the room, its presence palpable, as if it knew what was coming and was waiting for the right moment to strike. Sophia was a petite woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She carried a bag filled with herbs, crystals, and other tools of her trade, which she began to arrange around the mirror with careful precision. Maria tried to stay out of the way, but every time she glanced at the mirror, she felt its pull, a faint but insistent tug at the edges of her mind. Dr. Mendoza explained that this ritual would be more intense than the last, requiring all three of them to play a role. He handed Maria a small vial of clear liquid, instructing her to drink it when the time came. "It's meant to strengthen your spirit," he said. "The mirror will try to take control of you, and you'll need to resist." Maria nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the vial. The ritual began at sunset, the room bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia lit candles around the mirror, their flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made Maria's skin prickle. Sophia began to chant, her voice low and steady, while Dr. Mendoza drew symbols on the floor with a piece of chalk. As the chanting grew louder, the mirror began to react. Its surface rippled, as if something was stirring just beneath the glass, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Maria felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, despite the windows being closed. She glanced at Dr. Mendoza, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Stay strong," he said. "We're almost there." Sophia's chanting reached a crescendo, and the mirror let out a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the apartment. The shadows in the room deepened, their edges blurring as if they were alive. Maria felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were trying to tear its way out of her. She clutched the vial tightly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Now, Maria," Dr. Mendoza said, his voice firm. She uncorked the vial and drank the liquid in one gulp. It was bitter and made her throat burn, but almost instantly she felt a surge of clarity, as if a fog had been lifted from her mind. The pain in her chest lessened, and she was able to focus on the chanting, which seemed to fill the room with a protective energy. The mirror responded with a deafening crack, its surface splitting down the middle. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the crack, pooling on the floor and filling the air with a foul, metallic smell. Maria felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but she forced herself to stay focused. She could feel the mirror's presence now, a malevolent force that seemed to be trying to crawl into her mind. Sophia's chanting grew louder, her voice almost a shout now, and Dr. Mendoza stepped forward, holding a silver dagger in his hand. He began to carve symbols into the air around the mirror, his movements precise and deliberate. The liquid on the floor began to boil, hissing and spitting as if it were alive. Maria could feel the energy in the room shifting, the protective barrier growing stronger with every passing second. Just as it seemed the ritual was reaching its climax, the mirror let out a deafening roar, its surface shattering into 1,000 pieces. The liquid on the floor surged upward, forming a dark, shadowy figure that towered over them. Maria's heart raced as she recognized the figure. It was the same entity from her nightmares, its hollow eyes burning with malice. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia redoubled their efforts, their voices merging into a single powerful chant. The figure let out a guttural scream, its form beginning to dissolve as the energy in the room intensified. Maria felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. The figure let out one final, ear-splitting shriek before disappearing into the ether. When it was over, the room was silent, the air warm and still. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, its surface dull and lifeless. Maria collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with exhaustion. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia exchanged a relieved glance before turning to her. "It's over," Dr. Mendoza said. "The mirror's hold on you is broken." Maria nodded, tears of relief welling up in her eyes. She knew the nightmares were finally over. The days that followed the ritual were a blur for Maria. She spent most of her time in bed, her body and mind exhausted from the ordeal. The mirror was gone, its shattered pieces carefully removed by Dr. Mendoza, who assured her that the entity trapped within had been destroyed. But even as she tried to recover, a lingering unease settled over her, as if a shadow still clung to her soul. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia checked on her regularly, bringing food and herbal teas meant to help her regain her strength. Maria was grateful for their support, but she found it hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The nightmares had stopped, but she still woke up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced that the figure from the mirror was still there, watching her from the shadows. One evening, as she sat on the couch with a cup of tea, Maria noticed something strange. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy that reminded her of the mirror's presence. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her recovery, but the unease gnawed at her, refusing to be pushed aside. A week after the ritual, Maria began to notice small, inexplicable changes in her apartment. Objects would move on their own, dishes would fall from shelves, and the temperature would drop suddenly, even when the windows were closed. She tried to convince herself it was just the building settling or the stress of everything she'd been through, but deep down, she knew it was something more. She called Dr. Mendoza, her voice trembling as she described what was happening. He listened carefully before telling her it might be a residual effect of the mirror's influence. Sometimes, these things leave an imprint, he explained. But it should fade with time. Just keep an eye on it, and let me know if it gets worse. Maria nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already worse. That night, Maria woke to the sound of footsteps in her apartment. Her heart raced as she listened, the sound growing louder with each passing second. She grabbed the silver cross Dr. Mendoza had given her, clutching it tightly as she crept out of bed. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, but she could see shadows moving in the corners, their forms indistinct but unmistakably alive. She froze as a figure stepped into view, its features obscured by the darkness. For a moment, she thought it was the entity from the mirror, but then it spoke, its voice soft and familiar. "Maria," it whispered, "I'm still here." Her blood ran cold as she realized it was her own voice, echoing in the darkness. The figure stepped closer, and she could see its face, now hollow eyes, a twisted smile, and features that mirrored her own. Maria stumbled back, the cross slipping from her hand as the figure lunged at her. She screamed, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. The figure grabbed her arms, its grip cold and unyielding, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. She struggled against it, but it was too strong, its presence overwhelming. When she woke, she was lying on the floor, the apartment silent and still. She sat up, her body trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of the figure, but the air felt heavier than ever, the shadows deeper and more menacing. She crawled to the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, Maria called Dr. Mendoza, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the encounter. He listened in silence before telling her he would come over immediately. When he arrived, she could see the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. He set up his equipment around the apartment, searching for any sign of supernatural activity, but everything came back negative. "I don't understand," Maria said, her voice trembling. "If the mirror's gone, why is this still happening?" Dr. Mendoza hesitated before answering. Sometimes, the connection between a person and a haunted object is too strong to be severed completely, he explained. It's possible that part of the entity is still attached to you. Maria's heart sank as the weight of his words settled over her. As Dr. Mendoza packed up his equipment, Maria felt a growing sense of despair. She had thought the nightmare was over, but now she realized it was just beginning. The mirror was gone, but its influence still lingered, a dark shadow that refused to let her go. She clenched her fists, tears welling up in her eyes. She wouldn't give up, no matter what it took. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Maria could feel the shadow's presence growing stronger, its malevolence seeping into every corner of her life. It was no longer confined to her apartment. It followed her everywhere, a silent, insidious force that whispered in the back of her mind. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the evidence was undeniable. Dr. Mendoza returned to her apartment several times, bringing with him new tools and techniques to combat the entity. He performed cleansing rituals, burned sage, and even tried a more intense version of the initial ritual, but nothing worked. The shadow remained, a dark, oppressive presence that seemed to feed on her fear. Maria could feel it growing stronger with each passing day, its influence spreading like a cancer. One night, Maria woke to find herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, trapped by an unseen force. The reflection smiled, its lips twisting into a cruel grin, and Maria felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. She screamed, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. When she finally broke free, she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. She stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the mirror, half expecting the reflection to move again. But it remained still, the surface dull and lifeless, though she could still feel the shadow's presence, lurking just out of sight. The next morning, Maria called Dr. Mendoza, her voice trembling as she described what had happened. He listened in silence before telling her he would come over immediately. When he arrived, she could see the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. He set up his equipment around the apartment, searching for any sign of supernatural activity, but everything came back negative. "I don't understand," Maria said, her voice trembling. "If the mirror's gone, why is this still happening?" Dr. Mendoza hesitated before answering. Sometimes, the connection between a person and a haunted object is too strong to be severed completely, he explained. It's possible that part of the entity is still attached to you. Maria's heart sank as the weight of his words settled over her. As Dr. Mendoza packed up his equipment, Maria felt a growing sense of despair. She had thought the nightmare was over, but now she realized it was just beginning. The mirror was gone, but its influence still lingered, a dark shadow that refused to let her go. She clenched her fists, tears welling up in her eyes. She wouldn't give up, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Maria tried to fight the shadow on her own. She stayed awake as long as she could, terrified of what might happen if she fell asleep. She avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, afraid of what she might see. But the shadow was relentless, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as she sat on the couch, Maria felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, trapped by an unseen force. The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its presence overwhelming. Maria tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. The shadow reached out, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against her skin. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. When she woke, she was lying on the floor, the apartment silent and still. She sat up, her body trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of the shadow, but the air felt heavier than ever, the darkness deeper and more menacing. She crawled to the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, Maria called Dr. Mendoza, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the encounter. He listened in silence before telling her he would come over immediately. When he arrived, she could see the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. He set up his equipment around the apartment, searching for any sign of supernatural activity, but everything came back negative. As Dr. Mendoza packed up his equipment, Maria felt a growing sense of despair. She had thought the nightmare was over, but now she realized it was just beginning. The mirror was gone, but its influence still lingered, a dark shadow that refused to let her go. She clenched her fists, tears welling up in her eyes. She wouldn't give up, no matter what it took. Maria knew she couldn't keep living like this. The shadow was growing stronger, its presence suffocating, and she could feel it slowly consuming her. She called Dr. Mendoza and told him they needed to end this, once and for all. He agreed, though his voice was heavy with concern. "This will be dangerous," he warned. But it's the only way to free you from this. Maria nodded, her resolve hardening. She was ready to face whatever came next. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia arrived that evening, their faces grim as they prepared for the final confrontation. They brought with them an array of tools, ancient symbols, sacred oils, and a blade forged from silver. Maria watched as they set up the ritual, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Sophia explained that the ritual would require all three of them to play a role. Maria would have to confront the shadow directly, while Dr. Mendoza and Sophia worked to sever its connection to her. "This will be the hardest thing you've ever done," Sophia said, her voice firm but kind. "But you're stronger than it knows. Remember that." Maria nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. As the ritual began, the room grew colder, the shadows deepening until they seemed alive. Maria could feel the shadow's presence, a dark, oppressive force that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She closed her eyes and focused, trying to push the fear aside. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia began to chant, their voices merging into a powerful, resonant harmony. The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It moved toward Maria with unnatural speed, its presence overwhelming. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. She clutched the silver cross Dr. Mendoza had given her, using it as an anchor to keep herself grounded. The chanting grew louder, the energy in the room intensifying. Maria could feel the shadow's grip on her weakening, its hold slipping as the ritual progressed. But it wasn't giving up without a fight. The shadow lunged at her, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against her skin. She could feel its malevolence, its hatred, and for a moment she thought it would consume her. But then she remembered Sophia's words, "You're stronger than it knows." She clenched the cross tighter, focusing all her energy on pushing the shadow back. The pain in her chest grew sharper, but she didn't stop, her resolve hardening with each passing second. The shadow let out a guttural scream, its form beginning to dissolve as the ritual reached its climax. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia's chanting reached a crescendo, their voices merging into a single powerful sound that filled the room. The shadow let out one final, ear-splitting shriek before disappearing into the ether. The room fell silent, the air warm and still once more. Maria collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia rushed to her side, their faces filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Dr. Mendoza asked, his voice gentle. Maria nodded, though she could barely speak. She felt weak, drained, but also lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her chest. They helped her to the couch, where she sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The shadow was gone, its presence no longer weighing her down. But even as relief washed over her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air in the room still felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia stayed with her for several hours, monitoring her for any signs of the shadow's return. But everything seemed normal, the apartment peaceful and still. Maria tried to relax, but the lingering sense of unease refused to go away. When they finally left, Maria found herself alone in the apartment. She sat on the couch, staring at the spot where the shadow had emerged, half expecting it to return. But the room remained silent, the shadows still and lifeless. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to convince herself it was over. Maria woke the next morning feeling drained, her body heavy with exhaustion. She had hoped the ritual would bring an end to her nightmare, but instead, she found herself trapped in a strange limbo. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a faint but insistent tug at the edges of her mind. She tried to ignore it, to focus on rebuilding her life, but the unease refused to go away. The apartment felt different now, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. Maria found herself avoiding certain rooms, especially the one where the mirror had once stood. She could still feel its absence like a phantom limb, a void that seemed to pull at her whenever she passed by. Dr. Mendoza had assured her the entity was destroyed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting. She tried to distract herself by throwing herself into her work, but even that proved difficult. The lingering presence made it hard to concentrate, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the shadow. She found herself jumping at every noise, her heart racing at the slightest movement in the corner of her eye. The fear was always there, a constant companion that refused to let her go. One evening, as she sat on the couch, Maria felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, trapped by an unseen force. The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its presence overwhelming. Maria tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. The shadow reached out, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against her skin. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. When she woke, she was lying on the floor, the apartment silent and still. She sat up, her body trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of the shadow, but the air felt heavier than ever, the darkness deeper and more menacing. She crawled to the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, Maria called Dr. Mendoza, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the encounter. He listened in silence before telling her he would come over immediately. When he arrived, she could see the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. He set up his equipment around the apartment, searching for any sign of supernatural activity, but everything came back negative. "I don't understand," Maria said, her voice trembling. "If the shadow's gone, why is this still happening?" Dr. Mendoza hesitated before answering. Sometimes, the connection between a person and a haunted object is too strong to be severed completely, he explained. It's possible that part of the entity is still attached to you. Maria's heart sank as the weight of his words settled over her. As Dr. Mendoza packed up his equipment, Maria felt a growing sense of despair. She had thought the nightmare was over, but now she realized it was just beginning. The shadow was gone, but its influence still lingered, a dark presence that refused to let her go. She clenched her fists, tears welling up in her eyes. She wouldn't give up, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Maria tried to fight the shadow on her own. She stayed awake as long as she could, terrified of what might happen if she fell asleep. She avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, afraid of what she might see. But the shadow was relentless, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as she sat on the couch, Maria felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, trapped by an unseen force. The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its presence overwhelming. Maria tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. The shadow reached out, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against her skin. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. When she woke, she was lying on the floor, the apartment silent and still. She sat up, her body trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of the shadow, but the air felt heavier than ever, the darkness deeper and more menacing. She crawled to the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Maria woke to the sound of her own breathing, shallow and uneven, as though the air in the room had thinned. The apartment was quiet, but the silence felt different this time, charged, almost expectant. She sat up slowly, her body heavy, her mind foggy, and looked around. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, their edges sharp and menacing. She knew, without a doubt, that this was it, the final moment. The shadow was no longer lingering. It was ready. She called Dr. Mendoza, her voice trembling as she explained what she was feeling. He didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way," he said, his tone urgent. "Don't do anything until I get there." Maria nodded, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The shadow's presence was overwhelming now, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. She could feel it in every corner of the room, in every breath she took. When Dr. Mendoza arrived, he was accompanied by Sophia, both of them carrying bags filled with tools and supplies. Maria could see the worry in their eyes, but they hid it well, their movements calm and deliberate. They set up the ritual quickly, the air in the room growing heavier with each passing second. Maria watched, her heart pounding, as they drew symbols on the floor and lit candles, the flickering flames casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Sophia turned to Maria, her expression serious but kind. "This is it," she said. "The final step. You have to face the shadow directly. It will try to overwhelm you, but you're stronger than it. Remember that." Maria nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She could feel the shadow's presence growing stronger, its malevolence seeping into her bones. The ritual began, Dr. Mendoza and Sophia chanting in unison, their voices merging into a powerful, resonant harmony. The shadows in the room began to writhe, their forms twisting and shifting as though alive. Maria felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being ripped from her. She clutched the silver cross Dr. Mendoza had given her, using it as an anchor to keep herself grounded. The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It moved toward Maria with unnatural speed, its presence overwhelming. She felt a coldness seeping into her skin, a malevolence that made her stomach churn. The shadow's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel its hatred, its hunger. It wanted to consume her, to make her a part of itself. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia's chanting grew louder, the energy in the room intensifying. Maria could feel the shadow's grip on her weakening, its hold slipping as the ritual progressed. But it wasn't giving up without a fight. The shadow lunged at her, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against her skin. She could feel its desperation, its rage, and for a moment, she thought it would win. But then she remembered Sophia's words, "You're stronger than it knows." She clenched the cross tighter, focusing all her energy on pushing the shadow back. The pain in her chest grew sharper, but she didn't stop, her resolve hardening with each passing second. The shadow let out a guttural scream, its form beginning to dissolve as the ritual reached its climax. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia's chanting reached a crescendo, their voices merging into a single powerful sound that filled the room. The shadow let out one final, ear-splitting shriek before disappearing into the ether. The room fell silent, the air warm and still once more. Maria collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. Dr. Mendoza and Sophia rushed to her side, their faces filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Dr. Mendoza asked, his voice gentle. Maria nodded, though she could barely speak. She felt weak, drained, but also lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her chest. They helped her to the couch, where she sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The shadow was gone, its presence no longer weighing her down. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, the tension in her body slowly melting away. As Dr. Mendoza and Sophia packed up their equipment, Maria looked around the room. The shadows were just shadows now, ordinary and unassuming. The air felt warm, the energy in the room calm and steady. She knew it was over. The shadow was gone, and she was finally...